What's up, everybody? It's a new year, new episode. I'm back at it. Now, you are probably wondering if you've been following the podcast or the Substack. Where have you been? And that's a really good question. I have to begin with a confession. I committed the cardinal sin of podcasting. I didn't keep the churn going. And I'll explain why. Um, when I started the pod, I thought that I wasn't going to have a job in the university as a professor anytime soon, and it was a way of sort of pouring myself into theological education in a different way and pursuing something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. I've been thinking about the pod for years, and it was a long time in the development, so I absolutely have every intention of keeping it going, but it turned out to be quite a crunch as the semester got going. I was surprised by that. I've been learning hard lessons about time management and my own limitations, alas, because I've been spinning a lot of plates for a long time. I've always had a lot of projects going, but this just proved uniquely challenging, working multiple jobs, one of those involving not only prepping new classes, which is, as any professor will tell you, just monstrously time consuming, but also traveling for part of that. So if you don't know, my situation right now is that I am a half-time professor for Abilene Christian University's Department of Bible Missions and Ministry. And my arrangement is that I do one class online, and then I do one class each semester in a weekend intensive format that I fly out for 2 weekends. We do, crazy as it sounds, we do half a semester of content in one long weekend and the other half in another long weekend. And so that in itself is pretty grueling in a unique way. You don't usually prep half of a semester of content for a new prep because you're able to sort of go week to week and keep developing things, adapting, adjusting to where things are headed, and responding to the students. But instead, with this particular format, if it's a new prep, you're just going in having front-loaded half a semester of class content and then doing that a second time. The travel out there was a new wrench for me. I haven't had to travel for work before, and it created a unique psychological kind of dilemma for me. When I would come back to my other jobs, I would kind of feel like I had to be fully present for those to make up for lost time. I was gone for about a week at a time for each weekend, and it just felt like I couldn't or shouldn't maybe give time to side projects. So a bunch of things suffered. I mean, there was a lot of stuff that fell by the wayside over the last 4 or 5 months, and I intend for that to be different this semester. Like I said, I've been learning lessons about time management. I'm going to try to approach this a little differently and make sure not to persist in my sin. I'm going to keep that content coming, and so you can anticipate episodes to start flowing again and articles. Although, as I said, I wrote a year-end update on the Substack. I'm probably going to be, not probably, I'm going to have to make the effort, which is extreme for me, to write shorter posts. It's not my forte, but necessity at this point. And so hopefully that will benefit those of you who are always like, why is this so long? You can just say it shorter, and I'll do my best to do that. Okay, so let me do a reset here. I want to reset with a quotation from St. Augustine that I posted on Instagram a number of months ago, and sort of let that recenter us on the theme of this podcast, which is the journey that we're on. And Augustine is one of the most ancient writers to use this metaphor, and he says something pretty fascinating here. Since, therefore, we must enjoy to the full that truth which lives unchangeably, and since, within it, God the Trinity, the author and creator of everything, takes thought for the things that he has created, our minds must be purified so that they are able to perceive that light, and then hold fast to it. let us consider this process of cleansing as a trek or a voyage to our homeland. Though progress towards the one who is ever present is not made through space, but through integrity of purpose and character, this we would be unable to do if wisdom itself had not deigned to adapt itself to our great weakness and offered us a pattern for living. And it has actually done so in human form, because we too are human. So, although it is actually our homeland, it has also made itself the road to our homeland. I think that's just a phenomenal insight that, sometimes we say, like, the journey is the destination or something like that. From a more theological perspective, Augustine is observing that incarnate wisdom, the incarnation itself, the embodiment of God in Jesus, is both our destination and the road to our destination. That Jesus makes the pattern of living this journey out possible, and that he himself nonetheless is the destination. That to be with God and to become like God in conformity with Jesus Christ is what we're all about. So that just reminds me of why it's important to talk about these things and precisely what it is that I think I'm up to in the podcast. Okay, so with that said, let me just do a little commercial. If you're listening to this on Spotify, much appreciated. You can go over to Theology on the Way, theologyontheway.com, and watch full episodes. And if you're into the video format, I often am when I get the chance to sit down and watch a podcast. Most of it I listen to on Spotify, but you might want to check out the video. And if you subscribe on the Substack, you'll get articles as well. And if you become a paid subscriber, that has its own benefits. You can get some things that aren't otherwise available, and I'm going to continue to produce those as well, so I think that'll be worth your investment. But otherwise, you're supporting the whole production and everything that goes into me doing this and incentivizing me. That incentive was really strong, I can tell you. While I was lagging behind, I often had on my mind my paid subscribers who were undoubtedly wondering what in the world is going on. And so if you would like to join their voices in my mind, that's an easy thing to do and not all that expensive. So please consider a paid subscription. All right, so what have I been up to? Well, the teaching, both for Abilene and for Fuller. I still teach a course occasionally called Greek Tools for Biblical Interpretation. That's a master's course, and I kind of run students through a very quick, because Fuller does a quarter system rather than a semester system. It's a very quick crash course on using the tools that are available, particularly an application called Accordance, to grapple with the Greek text in their preaching and teaching and so on, and of course their term papers. But for Abilene, I was teaching a class called Christianity and Culture and another called just Theology. It's an intro to doctrine. So we kind of run through the whole spectrum of systematic theology. If you're not familiar with that, it's everything from creation through the nature of God, the nature of humanity, the nature of Jesus, Christology, atonement, the nature of the Spirit, pneumatology, all the way to end times, and much more. And so that class was a blast. My degree is in systematic theology, actually, even though I have focused on the interpretive dimensions of that, dealing with the biblical text theologically. But I absolutely love studying theology in that way, and certainly introducing students to it. That's the one that I traveled to Abilene for and got to teach in person, which was uniquely delightful. I love interacting with students in the classroom. It's much better than the online stuff, which has its own benefits and is a necessary medium. Look, we're on a podcast at the moment, so clearly I'm a fan of online theological education, but boy, is there something special about being in a classroom together, being able to dialogue, and giving me the opportunity in particular to respond to students, even nonverbal cues, and having a better sense of how things are going as we learn together and talk. And of course, that's what the Academy is for. I just had a conversation. The episode hasn't been released, but on another podcast that I participate in, it's very occasional. It's called Wordy. I've cross-posted an episode on theology on the way before. It's Wordy, word period Y podcast. You can find that on Spotify and all the other places. But the next episode will include some conversation about why the church needs the Academy. But I'll just say, as I kind of reflect on the teaching experience at Abilene, and especially the worst part of it, which is grading. And I don't know a professor, I've never met a professor yet that wouldn't tell you grading is the worst. It's the worst thing ever. It's drudgery, and it's no fun giving students bad grades and so on. But it's so necessary. What you need is a structured learning environment in which people with expertise can help you, can induct you into the process of learning, of becoming a good learner, of dealing with sources and forming your thoughts in ways that can withstand scrutiny and deserve attention. And that expertise thing is really important. That's really kind of what grading is about. To some extent, when I get jaded, I feel like, wow, this is just hoops to jump through, because accreditation requires that kind of process. And while that's true, I think the more fundamental truth is that students need feedback, and they need that feedback to come from someone who is in a position to actually say, look, here's what's going on with your work. Here's where you're missing the mark. Here's what's valid. Here's what's really good. We all need that kind of expertise in our life. We're dealing societally with a huge problem. And if you've never heard of the book, The Death of Expertise by Tom Nichols, I recommend it. That it'll introduce you to all of the dynamics. I think it was written in 2017. The dynamics, more broadly speaking, in our culture that have to do with the ways in which we no longer trust experts and the influx of information, good information and bad information, with which we don't know what to do because we can't parse it ourselves. We simply don't have enough understanding to make sense of this massive influx of information. It is leaving us in a bit of a bind societally. And, I think the Academy is essential culturally in that sense. We need that space and spaces like it where expertise is still of the highest value and manifests itself in these kinds of processes of learning, not just from people who know stuff, but from people who are qualified to actually help us understand what learning is about and how to sort out our thoughts and our misperceptions and make the best of what it is that we're internalizing. Yeah, so teaching, it's been a major aspect of this very time-consuming period of my life. One thing, just an aside, since I was teaching this theology class, I got to use a book that I co-wrote a number of years ago. It's called Discipleship and Community. It is actually right there on my shelf. It's the yellow one on my shelf. Discipleship and Community, A Theological Vision for the Future. We co-wrote this book. It was published in 2020, so it's a COVID book, which means it never really got the press that we were hoping it would. But it was a phenomenal experience for me. I got to co-write it with a couple of my former professors. Mark Powell, at the time, he was at Harding School of Theology, where I did my Master's of Divinity. and John Mark Hicks, who was also one of my professors there, although he was full-time at Lipscomb University, where I later adjuncted while I was writing my dissertation. And, as I moved beyond the years of study, these gentlemen became friends and then co-workers in different capacities, including this book. But here's what it's about. It's kind of an interesting thing that we did, I think. We tried to write a book that would both represent and challenge our tradition, Churches of Christ, theologically. There aren't a lot of books like this, and we took an approach that tried to center our theology on this abiding main theme in our church's tradition, which is discipleship. And so you hear the title, Discipleship and Community, and you think it's probably a book about discipleship. In fact, I was just on a message board where somebody was asking about works of systematic theology produced in Churches of Christ, and I waited a few days just to see the responses, and nobody was mentioning this book. And so I went ahead and said, hey, this is one you might want to look at. And the response was comical because and he said, the poster said, I didn't realize this was a book of systematic theology, but I, I guess I'm not surprised that you snuck systematics into a book on discipleship. And it's funny because actually, I think probably one way of saying it is that we snuck discipleship into a book of systematic theology. That is, it's not about discipleship, but discipleship is this controlling theme that ties together what we, John Mark, and I see as primary theological themes in our tradition that hold together around the idea and practice of discipleship. We take that very seriously, and we substantiate that in the book. I won't say more because you can just go and read it, and you should. It's available on Amazon and all the other places that you can find books. But it was cool to use that book toward the end of class. They had to interact with it in their final assignment because it's sort of a demonstration of like, look, it's written on a relatively popular level. We've heard different things about that. Some have said, yeah, this is readable for, church leaders and people sort of leading class discussions about these sorts of things. And others have said, wow, this is a little bit chewy for me. But it's sort of right there in that kind of intellectually challenging space where if you want to grapple with it, it's not technical. And so it demonstrates what it looks like to do theology in a tradition, do theology in a way that is sort of paying attention to where are you coming from and how do you think about of the whole spectrum of theology and doctrine, what has pride of place in your church context, and how would those things relate? How would you think about their connection? So just an aside, but I definitely want you all to know that book is out there. It's worth a look. What else? Well, I've definitely been working to finish revising my dissertation for publication, and the good news is it's done. I finally turned that thing in, revised and ready to go to, copy editors and all that kind of thing for publication at the very end of the year. And so that's off my desk, which was the biggest monkey on my back. Anytime I have had some extra time in the last year, it's been, okay, I've got to chip away at this. And so that's done, and I'm really excited. It's going to be published in a series on missional hermeneutics, and that's obviously what it's about. If you haven't heard me talk about my dissertation before, missional hermeneutics, the approach to biblical interpretation that begins with a theological understanding of God's mission and considers what our interpretation has to do with that from a bunch of angles. I take one very particular angle as my topic and focus there. But missional hermeneutics is, for me, you've heard me talk about this on other episodes, possibly essential for the healthy interpretation of Scripture in Christian churches. And so that's very exciting. And relatedly, a few months ago, an article that I wrote, well, it's a contribution to a handbook called the Handbook on Post-Conservative Theological Interpretation, was finally published. The book came out, and so I was excited to see that come out as well. This is sort of what I do in terms of scholarship in my, let's not call it spare time, but it's part of one of those plates that I'm spinning. Okay, it's always there, so I try to tackle that and make best use of my scholarship and passion for writing about these things. So what's next in that vein? Well, actually, I'm next going to be thinking about how to present what I wrote about in my dissertation that's going to be published for a popular audience, because it's definitely not. That one's technical. That's a very technical work and not for the faint-hearted when it comes to reading complex sentences and long footnotes and all that sort of thing. But now my focus is going to be turning that into some form of popular writing that will be more accessible to church folks. And so I'm excited to start working on that, and we'll see. That one will be, I'm sure, a while in the coming, but it's now on, let's say, the back burner. And then church work, of course, preaching and teaching, and we've had all kinds of fun classes and conversations and sermons over the last half year. I'll say the one that I'm really excited about right now, aside from, well, there's two. One I'm going to talk about at length momentarily, but the other one is a discussion that we've just began. We have a Wednesday night discussion group that kind of uses a set of practices to structure conversations so we can talk about a little bit more challenging topics in a way that's healthy and helpful. And have started a conversation on women as shepherds or elders in our local congregation. And so I'm pretty sure I'll be talking and or writing about that as we go. You can look forward to that. But that's a conversation that's underway. And at the same time, still keeping up with the ministry to homeless neighbors and guys and gals that are getting out of incarceration, still going into the Rutherford County Correctional Workhouse, Work Center, we call it the Workhouse, every week, and doing a Bible study and a recovery curriculum with a group of guys there. After months, we finally finished reading through the book of Mark, which was an absolute blast. And so now we've jumped into based on their interests and questions, we've jumped into the first 11 chapters of Genesis. We're kind of getting a big picture on creation and humankind and God, and that's all really, really fun. Continuing with the meals that we do every week mostly for our homeless neighbors, and working in partnership with Bethesda House Ministries. I was on the board for Bethesda House, and then have recently, in an effort to do this time management thing, have said, you know what, I need to step down. We're getting ready for our move. We're moving in the summer to Abilene, where I'll be full-time. And in the meantime, I've just got a ton of loose ends that I need to tie up, and so I've stepped away from that. But that partnership's going strong, and really amazing things happening in the lives of our friends. Okay, so let me talk about the sermon series that we're starting. This is on my brain, and so it made it onto the list for this episode. We have started a series on the book of Revelation. Challenging and exciting at the same time. Really interesting study from my perspective as I'm prepping for sermons, and my co-preachers are prepping for sermons and having conversations on the side. Well, I'll tell you, I'm using a couple of books that I want to tell you about. If you're not, you probably have heard of one or two of these, but I'm using Michael Gorman's Reading Revelation Responsibly, which I've got this right here, and I'm guessing that there's going to be way too much glare to actually, oh no, it's not too bad. Reading Revelation Responsibly, uncivil worship and witness, following the Lamb into the new creation. That one's been out for a while. Gorman is amazing. His work has consistently shaped my thinking. A huge fan of his. And then newer book, Scott McKnight's. That one's got the glare on it. Revelation for the Rest of Us. A prophetic call to follow Jesus as a dissident disciple. So you hear some themes there: uncivil worship and witness, dissident discipleship. This is sort of the tack we're taking, and yet we have to address the stuff that immediately comes to mind. So many people when they think of the Book of Revelation, they feel either overwhelmed by the craziness of it because it's crazy, or just sort of frustrated and disgusted by the way that it gets used to legitimize, I don't know, these kind of agendas that churches have, where they're constantly trying to convince people that the end times are upon us and they've got the right interpretation of the dates of when everything's going to happen, and this or that political event, it correlates to this thing in the Book of Revelation, and so it's happening now. And you can tell by the way I'm talking about it, I'm not a fan of that approach. I think there's a tremendous amount of hubris in imagining that our moment is the moment, right? This is about us in that sense, in the predictive sense, that these things weren't about any other moment, they're about our moment. We are here at the pinnacle, the climax of everything, and hubris. It's pretty arrogant to think that way, and I think that's the case generally, but especially if you just look at the history of interpretation, the way so many people over and over and over for the last 2,000 years have played that game and have ginned up a following of people who think that they have the right understanding, and kind of get into an eschatological furor, if you will. They get really worked up and start doing sometimes kind of crazy things in response to that. I don't have any appreciation for that approach. I think it is a fundamental misunderstanding of what Revelation is about, as well as the way that we should interact with it, the way that we should interpret it. And so we're taking a different approach, but that leaves us still with a real conundrum, because if you read Gorman, if you read McKnight, and any number of other scholars, those two guys are New Testament scholars and renowned ones, but you can read so many other works that are approaching this with some theological seriousness and discounting that kind of fanatical end-time speculation, and yet at the same time emphasizing the need for imagination. So there's this interesting tension between speculation and imagination. We need imagination to read Revelation responsibly, and we need not speculate about this or that symbol in the book referring to us specifically in a historical moment, in terms of some kind of phenomenon or happening, in our immediate context or global context. It's often stuff about, Israel's at war again, and this is the one, and so now we know that it's happening, and so on and so forth. What's the difference between imagination and speculation? Well, what we're dealing with is the fact that Revelation is chock full of apocalyptic symbolism. Apocalyptic refers to its genre, the kind of literature that it is. Like many of the prophets of the Old Testament, the way that visions are communicated is through poetic imagery that try to bring the hearers or readers into that space where a truth is being unveiled, being revealed. In fact, that's why it's called Revelation, right? The Greek word apocalypsis is the word for revelation, unveiling, making something transparent or known. And so how do you reveal something that is, in a sense, beyond human capacity to perceive? Um, well, God, very apparently, if you're reading scripture, does that through symbolic portrayals, let's call them, of deeper realities, things that are beyond our immediate experience. And in order to appreciate how those are functioning to enliven our understanding, we have to exercise the human capacity for imagination. And as I was preparing for the first sermon that I preached in the series and thinking a lot about imagination, it struck me, it had never struck me before, but I realized, well, that I've been equipped for this interpretive work in a peculiar way. And that is that I am a more than casual reader of fantasy. I love fantasy literature. You can see uh, homage to Tolkien and Lewis on the shelf behind me. For the majority of my life, I've been a pretty avid reader of the fantasy genre, which means that the work of imagination is really well known to me. And it struck me just how much guys like Tolkien and Lewis, particularly guys like them who were Christians writing fantasy, really inaugurating the genre of fantasy and science fiction, um, were engaged in precisely this, that Revelation is a kind of invitation into John's wardrobe. You know, if you think of the Narnia story and going into the wardrobe and finding yourself in a world with talking animals and evil witches and monsters and all of that. That's really how Revelation functions. It's this invitation into John's wardrobe, where you're going to have to exercise imagination to understand what this is actually about, the meaning, the significance that the story is portraying is captured in this symbolism, this revelatory, apocalyptic symbolism that meets historical reality. It's about truth, it's about what's really going on. And so that tension between imagination and speculation gets really intense at that point, because the hubris of making Revelation about our moment predictively is pretty gross. And yet we need to make Revelation about every moment theologically. It is a story for us, about us, because it's about the reality behind the veil, the reality beyond the wardrobe. And yet it's not about us in the predictive sense, where we have to speculate about what does this particular symbol correlate to in our moment historically, right? About us, but not about us. And so that's where the tension lies. It's fascinating to try to lead a congregation into that kind of imaginative work without falling into the speculative work that has become so endemic to like evangelical conservative Christian culture in America, not least. So that's kind of what we're up to with the book of Revelation. And I would just encourage you, if you haven't looked at it in a while, because either it scares you off or because, you know, it's no fun to get caught up in that kind of speculation and find yourself alongside people who are clearly driven by other agendas. Just crack it open, take a look, and consider that what you're being invited into is a world that your imagination allows you to interact with. And it's a real world. It's not fantasy in the sense that the books I read are fantasy. It's a symbolic world that's telling you truths about what's happening all around us, and in a very important sense, equipping us to be dissident disciples, to worship and witness uncivilly, to resist the narrative about the way things are, that so easily co-opts us and makes us numb to deeper truths. Those deep truths are right there, and really, especially represented in the book of Revelation. It's a very good thing for the church that it is in the canon of Scripture, strange as it is. Okay, last topic. I would be remiss at this moment. It's January 18th, 2025, and as a Christian podcaster, I suppose I'm almost obligated to say something about the fact that Joe Rogan finally had a legit Christian apologist on his podcast. Now, I've talked about Rogan before on the pod, and I will continue talking about Rogan because he has the largest audience on the planet. And so it matters a great deal that he is regularly talking about Scripture, Christian tradition, God, spirituality. These are topics that he constantly addresses in one way or another. And it is a huge relief to many of us that at last he has invited on a guest who has expertise in these areas from a Christian perspective. Wesley Huff was his guest. He is a Canadian apologist, and he sort of brands himself as an apologist in his social media, but actually he is a New Testament scholar. He's a PhD. His area of expertise is what it needed to be for the Rogan episode. Because so much of what Rogan talks about when it comes to the Bible is the hoopla about which texts are legitimate and who made them up and how much have they changed over history and how do we even know what they said originally or what they didn't say and all of that kind of stuff. And for that, you need a scholar like Wesley Huff, whose area of expertise is precisely what we would call broadly text criticism. And he works in a sub-area of that, dealing specifically with some of the scribal conventions that we use in order to substantiate whether or not an ancient text, a copy of some part of the New Testament that we find is authentic, and deal with things like if it's different from other copies, why is it different and what happened and those sorts of things. And so that's a whole field of scientific investigation that anybody that gets even an undergraduate Bible degree, you're introduced to the basics of this, and then if you go on to do, like I did, a Master's of Divinity or just a Master's of New Testament or a Master's of Ministry or something, you're inevitably going to address these things at some depth in order to have an understanding of how it is that we get the Greek version of the New Testament that is used for translations into English and other languages. So everybody that has an English Bible is relying on the validity of the texts that stand behind it. And the science of determining validity is really extensive. It's more developed in terms of biblical literature than any other field. And consider, we work with translations like that of other documents that are in ancient languages, and have very few copies, often just one or two copies to go by. You think of any of your famous ancient philosophers, we have a very small set of copies that aren't ever as old as the copies of say the New Testament that we have. And so and those New Testament copies, we have thousands upon thousands of either complete manuscripts or fragments, and so there's a lot of work that you have to do in text criticism to compile all of that and sort out, okay, what are we working with here? And Huff is one of those guys. He professionally works in helping sort out those issues. So Rogan has him on. It's a phenomenal episode. I would encourage you to listen to it if you can handle Rogan's colorful language. And it came out of a kind of scandal, well, maybe drama. It came out of some drama from another podcast that Wesley Huff did recently with one of these guys on YouTube that purveys misinformation about the biblical text, origins, sources, and so on. There's a lot of that stuff out there. It's the kind of, I don't know if you've ever watched some of these wild History Channel shows or even just, think of Dan Brown, think of the Da Vinci Code and the kind of the mythology that goes into what really happened and how the church corrupted the things that were said, and now it's, been handed down and everybody takes it for granted. But it's like, listen, we have a tremendous scholarly apparatus that works to validate what our texts, okay? So Christian theologians in particular, biblical scholars, aren't playing a game of like trying to hide the evidence and make it so that nobody really knows what's going on. It's public information. It's out there. I mean, there's shelves and shelves and shelves of books on this stuff written not only by Christian scholars, but many other textual scholars that will easily give you a sense of where things stand and how much we should trust these documents to be what we would call historically reliable. Okay, so Huff presents himself as an apologist because so much of the conversation in our culture is about those things. It's this side conversation about, well, we can't really trust that stuff. It's corrupted by the church and changed over time and all those sorts of claims. Baseless claims that are easily debunked, but that's where the conversation often stands. And so you need a guy like Huff to come in and say, look, here he talks very understandably. He's good at sort of explaining step by step, here's how this works, and here's where these documents come from and what they are. And that is a really vital part of apologetics, the practice of offering a defense of Christian faith. I'm not a huge fan of apologetics, I'll just say. And the reason why is because it's almost always playing the game of skepticism. It's meeting people there in their skepticism to say, yeah, the whole framework by which you would doubt the validity of this stuff is legitimate, and it's a modernist framework. It's an atheistic framework. It's one in which you ought not to believe things, and so you go into that and try to convince people to believe things. A lot of the arguments that apologists offer I find to be relatively useless because what you're not going to do is talk someone into having faith. You're not going to logically convince them. Here's what apologetics is good for, and this is to a great extent what Huff is in the business of doing. It is to create what we call in sociology a plausibility structure. This is a term that comes from a sociologist named Peter Berger, and it refers to the fact that what we believe about something is a function of the social environment that makes that belief possible. Now, that might sound kind of scary, like, okay, what you're saying is we don't believe things because they're true. We believe things because our social environment makes us think they're true. Not exactly. We believe things are true because we trust evidence that far exceeds our ability to scrutinize. And so we trust the social environment that validates those beliefs. That's the case for everyone. That's the case for atheists. And so plausibility structures don't simply stand on their own as givens. They themselves are propped up by all sorts of arguments and evidence. A plausibility structure requires those sorts of supports. Any plausibility structure, one like Christian faith, the plausibility structure that makes it plausible to believe what Christians believe, requires, things like the validation of the biblical texts as historical documents. Now, what that doesn't do is cause you to believe what those documents are claiming. All it does is make it possible to take them seriously, that this is in fact what they're claiming. This isn't some fabrication from later on. These are documents that you can read and with a tremendously high degree of confidence know that this is what these authors said. And this is how they said it. And this is how what they said has been translated, and so on and so forth. So what an apologist can do is shore up that plausibility structure. They can't, and almost never do, go into a situation and convince someone to believe what, say, the Bible is claiming. That's not how faith works. And we'll talk about that more at a different time. So it's exciting to see Rogan, who is so often talking about the validity of those plausibility structure supports, engage with someone who can speak very intelligently about them. And back to the drama, right? So basically what happened was Huff engaged with one of these YouTubers. I can't even remember his name, but he's very popular, huge following, who's often saying things about the Bible that just are nonsense. And Huff, systematically deconstructed this guy on camera, and then this guy really didn't want the episode to be published, and it became a whole thing. And so that put him on Rogan's radar, and hence the invitation. This is the power of social media, having these conversations on platforms that make them broadly available and allow sort of the liking and sharing to bring them to the surface. And the net effect of that was this episode, which we've been long anticipating, finally. And what I really appreciated about the way that Rogan interacted with him is the way that he interacts with pretty much every guest he has on who's an expert in an area. He reacts with profound curiosity and sort of wonder at how much it takes to be an expert in something and to actually know about it and to speak intelligently about it, and then ultimately to explain it in a way that a huge audience like his can digest. And I just so appreciated him sort of saying over and over, man, it takes years and years of really deep and grueling study and learning ancient languages, dead languages, to even begin to have some sense about what's what here. So here's the callback. We go back to why the church needs the academy, the importance of this structured learning environment where experts are able to continue not only to generate this kind of knowledge, but induct others into it, and then speak competently about these kinds of issues. Here's what it reveals, the conversation as a whole. We are just awash in bad information, bad ideas, and really have no way on our own of sorting that out. We have to rely on experts. Experts are a part of the plausibility structure. They are what makes it feasible for us to trust, to know things in the first place, things that are beyond our capacity to know on our own. We couldn't possibly read enough in every area of human inquiry to draw our own conclusions. We have to trust. And so we're in the midst, on this journey of a grueling process of sorting out who are we going to listen to and why would we listen to them. And that has, I think, a lot to do with the way that they go about with integrity, with transparency, talking about what they know and sharing that, making it available for others. I'm going to keep trying to do that myself. I hope that Theology on the Way will be a source of not only interesting and engaging, but valid information about Christian theology and how we ought to be thinking about God, the church, the world, and everything in between. All right, that's it for this episode. Thanks for tuning in. I'll talk at you soon. Peace.